Hello, fourth graders, and welcome to lesson 4 of this unit on word problems. Today, we're going to be talking about word problems that involve comparisons, specifically multiplication and division comparisons. And our goal today is to practice writing multiplication and division equations for those comparison problems when we come across them. So today, we're talking about comparing, and we're going to learn how to use comparison bars to help us model the equations we're working with. So first, let's talk about comparison. Here is a problem. Rashmi picked 15 apples, while her little brother, Eli, picked 3 apples. Now let's compare this. So Rashmi picked 15, Eli picked 3. And when we look at these, what two quantities are we comparing? Well, we're comparing the number of apples that Rashmi and Eli picked. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to talk about addition and subtraction and comparing. But for this lesson, we are talking about multiplication and division. So remember that comparing is describing what is the same or different between two things, or describing something in terms of something else. So describing how many apples Eli picked in relation to how many Rashmi picked, or describing how many apples Rashmi picked compared to how many Eli picked, okay? And we're going to be using multiplication and division to do that. So what language do we use when we're talking about multiplication when we're comparing things? Well, often we use times as many to compare when we're multiplying. So we would say, how many times as many apples did Rashmi pick as her brother? We're not just asking how many more apples, because we could just count those and add on or subtract. We're not doing addition or subtraction. We're doing multiplication. So how many times as many apples? So Eli picked 3. Rashmi picked 15. So we might think multiplication, okay, so many times 3 equals 15. Rashmi picked something times as many, okay? Or if we're thinking division, we would think, well, 15 divided by 3 or divided into groups of 3 will tell us how many times as many apples Rashmi picked. And you're looking at this already and thinking, I know my 3 times table facts. And of course, 5 times 3 is 15. And 15 divided by 3 is 5. So how many times as many apples did Rashmi pick as her brother? 5 times as many. So if we're looking at this problem just with the apples, now we can talk about how to use comparison bars to help us figure this out. You can see that a bar, I've just drawn a bar around the apples for Rashmi and for Eli. Eli has 3 apples. So I have split Rashmi's apples into groups of 3. Because whenever we use comparison bars, we always split the largest amount into groups that the smallest amount has. So Eli has 3. So we're going to split Rashmi's apples into 3. And comparison bars would look like this. Okay, we don't have to draw all the apples every time. We can just use bars to represent the apples. So Rashmi picked 15, and we're going to split that 15 into groups of 3 because Eli picked 3. And then we can see how many groups of 3 to find out how many times as many. So Rashmi's apples equaled 5 times Eli's apples. And Eli's apples is Rashmi's amount divided by 5. So we would say Rashmi picked 5 times as many apples as Eli picked. 15 is 5 times as many as 3. So we can represent this comparison with 2 equations. 15 equals 5 times 3, or 3 equals 15 divided by 5. Remember that in all of our word problems, we need to write equations to represent the situation and the solution. So let's practice. Let's look. To prepare for a family gathering, Sarah and Ryan made soup. Sarah made 2 quarts, Ryan made 6 quarts. let's compare. Remember, comparing means taking the two numbers and relating them to each other. Let's compare amounts using multiplication and division. Well, I'm going to use comparison bars to help me. So Ryan and Sarah, we know Sarah made 2 quarts. And we know Ryan made 6. And I have split that 6 into groups of 2 because Sarah made 2 quarts. And we always split the bigger number into groups of whatever the smaller number is. Okay, that's how we figure out how many times is many. So if we were to write a multiplication equation, we would say, well, R for Ryan equals 3 times S, which is Sarah. And we get the 3 by saying, well, there's 3 groups of 2, which is how many Sarah had. So 3 times S. We can also write that as R equals 3S. There are different ways to write multiplication. Remember, we can use the X for the times sign. We can use the asterisk or the dot. And we can also just put a number and a letter together, which means 3 times S. So 3S means 3 times S. If we were to write a division equation, we would have S for Sarah equals R divided by 3. So Ryan's soup divided into 3 groups. So Ryan made 3 times as many quarts as Sarah. And you might notice that that is on the first page for class activity 4-4 for today. So that's the example at the top of the page that we've looked at together. Now let's work on the rest of the questions for this page. So we're on page 135. We've done the example at the top. We're just going to work through the next one together, which is also about soup. It tells us that Natasha made 12 quarts of soup. Manuel made 3 quarts. Now get your pencils ready because you have to draw the comparison bars for Natasha and Manuel's soup. So you're going to have Natasha first as the biggest amount, and then Manuel. And Manuel made 3 quarts. So we know that Manuel's bar is just going to have 3. Okay. Natasha's bar of 12 is going to be split into groups of 3 because Manuel only made 3. And we're figuring out how many times as many quarts of soup Natasha made. Okay. So your comparison bars, you're going to have one of 12 that has 4 groups of 3. And then Manuel's is just going to have the 1 group of 3. So Natasha's soup is 4 groups of Manuel's amount. And Manuel's soup comparison bars is Natasha's amount divided by 4, divided into 4 groups. So once you've drawn your bars, let's go to question 2. Blank made 4 times as many quarts as blank. Who made 4 times as many quarts as someone else? Well, by looking straight at the comparison bars, we can see that Natasha made 4 times as many quarts as Manuel because she has 4. Lots of 3. Manuel just has the 1 group of 3. Now we're going to write these equations. Write a multiplication equation that compares the amounts. You are not being asked to solve anything. You're just being asked to compare the 2 amounts. Natasha's amount, which will represent with an N, and Manuel's amount, which will represent with an M. So let's do that. Let's do Natasha's amount equals 4M. Remember that when you put a number and a letter together, it just means 4 times M. You could also write N equals 4 times M, or 4 dot M, or 4 asterisk M. And they will all mean the same thing. But N equals 4M, or 4 times M. That would be a multiplication equation. Now we need to write a division equation that compares the amounts. Can you think of what the division equation might be? Right. Manuel's amount, so the expression on one side of the equal sign is going to be the m, which is going to represent the 3, equals n divided by 4, because we need a division equation. So if we took Natasha's amount and divided it by 4, n divided by 4, that expression equals m. So there's our division equation. Now multiplication is the putting together of equal groups. How can this idea be used to explain why a times as many comparing situation is multiplication? Why does times as many mean multiplication when we're comparing? You can pause here and talk about this. Well, when we're doing times as many, we are taking one group and we are repeating that group to see how many times as many. So the greater amount in our comparing equations, the greater amount is shown by just repeating groups of the lesser amount. That's why times as many is a way of showing multiplication when we're comparing, when we're using equal groups. You can take a moment to jot that down at the bottom of page 135. Now, page 136 has 4 problems on it, and we're just going to do one of these problems together. We're going to work on question 7 because it is using these comparison bars and it's asking a question that is slightly different. It's kind of fun. So this question says, question 7, there are 180 pennies in Miguel's coin collection, and that is 5 times as many as the number of quarters in his coin collection. How many quarters does Miguel have? Remember, with a word problem, we're always looking, what is the question asking us? We need to know how many quarters Miguel has. Tells us how many pennies, 180, and that is 5 times as many as the number of quarters. But we need to figure out the number of quarters. So let's use our comparison bars. We know pennies and quarters are going to be our comparison bars, but we don't know what the number is for how many quarters. So we don't know what to put in our repeated groups, but we know there are 180 pennies altogether. And because we know it's 5 times as many, we can make comparison bars with 5 groups. We've just got to figure out what is this number we're going to put in the groups. So let's think about a multiplication equation first. So we could say that 5q, q is for quarters, 5q, or 5 times q, remember that's what that means, equals 180. Yep, and we just need to solve q equals what? For division, a division equation, we could say 180 divided by 5 equals q. Let's do that. Let's use 180 divided by 5 equals q to solve, because this question is asking us to solve the problem. We need to find out how many quarters. So I used the digit by digit method and I divided 180 by 5. You can see all the steps that I worked through here. And my final answer, my quotient, was 36. So that tells me that Miguel has 36 quarters, which must mean that all of these 5 groups, if I split 180 into 5 groups, each of those 5 groups has 36. So Q, or number of quarters, is 36. Miguel has 36 quarters in his collection. So look out for that when you're doing the word problems today. You are going to be using comparison bars, and you are going to need to write equations that maybe compare, but you're also going to have to write equations to solve the problem. So sometimes you might be solving what's in the smallest comparison bar, like the one we just did together, and other times not. So read the questions carefully to solve the problems, and there is an exit ticket to work on when you're finished. There are only 2 class activity pages for this lesson. And we did the whole first page, page 135 together. So you're done on that page. On page 136, we did question 7. So you have 6, 8, 9 to go before the exit ticket. Have fun.